soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force. You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumph of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeat in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
The Normandy landings have attained a special place in the pantheon of amphibious assaults, and rightfully so. Yet while they were of such scope and sophistication so as to eclipse all others that came before, they were hardly a new kind of operation. The objectives of Normandy would have been immediately recognizable to the Athenians landing in Sparta, the Roman legions that assaulted Carthage, the Turks laying siege to Malta, the Spanish in their invasion of Sicily, the British in their attack on the citadel of Quebec, or the Anzac forces at Gallipoli. It goes on and on. And amphibious assaults didn't end with Operation Overlord. They would be repeated across the Pacific on Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and later in Shan. In the Suez Crisis, the Falklands War, the Gulf War, and the Iraq War, amphibious assaults all played a central role. They have been a part of warfare since antiquity, and remain so in the modern world. But do they have a place within the conflicts of interstellar nations? What happens when these kinds of landings are not launched from vessels plying the world's oceans, but starships in orbit of some alien world? Can Marines be expected to seize not only island chains or continental beachheads, but entire planets? And is there even a need for such operations? Would planetary invasions be feasible? And if they are, what might they look like? What would their objectives and stages be? What equipment would they use to ferry troops from orbit? These are the questions we'll be trying to answer on this episode of Incoming. And lock yourself into a drop capsule, break out the flash-frozen beef stroganoff rations and vanilla Coke powder, and settle in for a lively descent, because this is a long one. Of course, with any guide like this comes the reminder that interstellar warfare might be drastically different depending on which alternate world you find yourself within.
Watch as I fire upwards through our own shield!
Oh, he's a madman! A madman!
With that in mind, this guide might not be relevant to every planetary invasion, but hopefully this can be something of a starting point. Right away, I think the first thing we need to address is the idea that within an interstellar war, planetary invasions would no longer be necessary or even possible, doomed to obsolescence alongside cavalry charges or boards with nails in them. Now, this is a huge discussion and ties into a lot of theories and doctrines. But the main argument against invasions is that if an attacking force has managed to achieve orbital supremacy over a target world or within some manner of gravity well, then they will have gained such a massive advantage as to render any further resistance completely pointless. If you have a fleet of starships in orbit, there's no need to send down hundreds of thousands or even millions of troops to take control of a planet. You can instead just threaten to bombard any local population centers or enemy armies, Surely even the most fanatical defenders would have their self-preservation instincts kick in once a few of their cities have been destroyed and they have no feasible way to fight back. Orbital bombardment, it is argued, is the ultimate winning hand. Even just the threat of it would be enough to force a surrender. No need for a lengthy planetary invasion. What I love about this argument is it's one that you see again and again throughout history whenever a new kind of weapon is developed. And in every case, the argument is completely invalidated, sometimes almost immediately. Case in point, let's go back to 1949 to an event known as the Revolt of the Admirals. The US Navy at this time was in a difficult position. Despite all the successful landings across the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and Europe during World War II, it was now operating in the shadow of a mushroom cloud. Many prominent military thinkers were arguing that in a world in which the atomic bomb exists, there's no longer much need for conventional forces. There's no point funding that new class of supercarrier, for example, because what good is a carrier when a fleet of bombers can go anywhere in the world and drop a bunch of atomic weapons? That's what a future war is going to look like. And US Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson subscribed to this kind of thinking, saying, "The Navy is on its way out. There's no reason for having a Navy and Marine Corps. General Bradley tells me that amphibious operations are a thing of the past. We'll never have any more amphibious operations. That does away with the Marine Corps. And the Air Force can do anything the Navy can do nowadays, so that does away with the Navy." And what Johnson was referencing here was testimony by the General of the Army, Omar Bradley, the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to the House Armed Services Committee, saying, "I predict that large-scale amphibious operations will never occur again." From a man of his record, that is some compelling testimony. But when you have each branch of the armed forces fighting for funding and relevance, you might not want to take the advice of the Army at face value when they say that the Navy is pointless. It's possible there might be a slight bias there. But the real issue is that Bradley and Johnson were locked into a very narrow point of view. They apparently couldn't conceive of a conflict in which atomic bombs wouldn't be used. But just 1 year later, that very kind of conflict begins, and the shortcomings of a defense policy primarily reliant on nuclear weapons instead of conventional forces becomes obvious to everyone. North Korea invades the South, and US President Harry Truman is shocked to discover that after so many cuts to the Navy, he can't even enforce a blockade anymore. So the Admirals are vindicated. They get their new supercarrier, and the Marine Corps gets to stick around. Defense Secretary Johnson, the man who said that amphibious assaults are a thing of the past, is asked to resign. And his resignation comes on the same day as victory is achieved in the Battle of Incheon, an amphibious assault into the Korean Peninsula, which today is almost universally recognized as one of the most decisive military operations in modern warfare, a strategic masterpiece. This same story plays out in more or less the same way, seemingly every decade. We don't need a navy. If there's a war, we'll just drop an atomic bomb. Just ask Lewis Johnson. We don't need to invade Vietnam. We'll just send them back to the Stone Age with precision bombing. Just ask Curtis LeMay. We don't need to invade Nazi Germany. There's no city in Europe worth the bones of one British grenadier. All we need is strategic bombing. Just ask Arthur Harris. Go back in time far enough, and you'll probably find someone arguing, we don't need swords, the bow and arrow has rendered them obsolete. Go forward in time far enough, and we just get the next version of the same argument. We don't need planetary invasions, orbital bombardment can win the war by itself. So why is this wrong? Why weren't atomic bombs used in Korea? Why didn't strategic bombing force Vietnam or Germany to surrender? Why won't orbital bombardment make planetary assaults pointless? I think the answers fall into two general categories. The first is in a case like in Korea, where for political, economic, or military reasons, it's just not advisable to use these weapons regardless of whether or not they're effective. The second category concerns cases like World War II or Vietnam, where these supposedly war-winning weapons are being used, but you just don't see the results you were hoping for. And let's switch things up a bit and start with this second category. Why might orbital bombardment not be effective in forcing a planet to surrender? This is going to depend a lot on circumstances and the kind of war you're fighting, but here's a few general reasons, all of which you can see examples of at some time throughout history. The first, and probably most common reason, is that maybe the effectiveness of your weapons has been a little overstated. Sure, you got your fleet of starships in orbit bombarding the enemy, but they're just not doing enough damage. The power of your lasers is being dissipated by the atmosphere. Or your missile guidance systems aren't handling orbital re-entry very well. The asteroids you're flinging at the planet keep breaking up and missing their target. Maybe your command and control arrangement is a complete mess, and you got different branches of the armed forces actively working against each other's objectives. Whatever it is, for some reason, your bombardment campaign just isn't effective enough. Don't feel too bad, it happens to the best of us. Or, what if all your weapons are working just as advertised, but the enemy isn't quite as helpless as you thought? There's anti-starship batteries situated all over, and it's starting to take a real toll on your orbital forces. Some of them are even heavily mobile, and you're unable to target them accurately from space. Worse still, your lasers can't penetrate the planetary shields, your missiles are being diverted by countermeasures, and your asteroids are being intercepted by an anti-ballistic missile system. The balance of interstellar warfare has swung around to favor the defender, and orbital supremacy isn't quite the killer hand it was supposed to be. Could be for any number of futuristic reasons.
It's an easy fix, one line of dialogue. Thank God we invented the, whatever device.
But maybe you got lucky and everything is going your way. Your ships are in orbit, and at your command, you can start bombarding the planet. There's no way the defenders can fight back, and you know for a certainty that you can hit your targets. Surely, in this instance, bombard the planet long enough and you can force a surrender, right? Well, maybe not so much. The idea that an enemy nation will eventually give up, that they'll all submit to their own instinct of self-preservation, is often overstated. This theory was used to justify the bombing campaigns like Operation Linebacker in the Vietnam War and the Combined Bomber Offensive in the Second World War, and in each instance, they were controversial because it was difficult to prove their effectiveness. While the economic impact of these campaigns was severe, and enemy morale was sometimes deeply affected, it was never enough to provoke any kind of capitulation. The affected populations became defeatist and depressed. There were reports of an overwhelming malaise, but this never evolved into mass demonstrations against the continuation of the war. Not in London in 1941, or Berlin in 1945, or Hanoi in 1968. In Nazi Germany in particular, no matter how severe the strategic bombing became, in the minds of their leadership, the cost of resistance was still less than the cost of surrender. No matter how much damage was inflicted, German leaders did not believe that the conquest of Germany itself had become inevitable. Only ground forces seizing and holding German territory were able to change their minds. But I think it's fair to address the one time in which strategic bombing did immediately precede an enemy surrender: the atomic attacks on Japan during World War II. As you might expect, this is a complex and controversial discussion, and not one I feel is necessarily appropriate to have in a video like this. But suffice to say, there remains compelling arguments that other factors contributed more to the decision to surrender. I don't personally agree with all of them, but even if we accept the premise that the atomic bombs alone were responsible for the Japanese surrender, as we're about to discuss, there are still circumstances in which using these kinds of weapons is not appropriate for the situation. Just because they might have worked once doesn't mean they'll work every time. Let's play devil's advocate here. We'll assume for the moment that orbital bombardment is effective at striking a planet and even has the potential to force an enemy to surrender. Now we can go back to that first category. The United States had atomic bombs in Korea, the orbital bombardment of its era, but didn't use them. So why wouldn't you want to use a weapon that you have in your arsenal, whether it's nuclear-armed bombers or plasma beam-armed spaceships? To put it a different way, what is the point of training a bunch of Marines to use knives when all you need to do is push a button? Well, let's ask drill instructor Zim of the Terran Federation.
The enemy cannot push a button if you disable his hand.
Oh, sorry, that's my fault. I should have been more specific. I meant the other drill instructor Zim, Charles Zim. When asked the same question, this is how he responded. If you wanted to teach a baby a lesson, would you cut its head off? Of course not. You'd paddle it. There can be circumstances when it's just as foolish to hit an enemy city with an H-bomb as it would be to spank a baby with an axe. War is not violence and killing, pure and simple. War is controlled violence for a purpose. The purpose of war is to support your government's decisions by force. The purpose is never to kill the enemy just to be killing him, but to make him do what you want him to do. Not killing, but controlled and purposeful violence. The whole thing about hitting babies aside, what Zim is talking about here is the idea of proportional response and conflict escalation. And this concept is by no means exclusive to interstellar war. This is something that's been a part of conflict and international relations probably since the dawn of human civilization. There's diplomatic escalation, economic escalation, but since we're talking about planetary invasions, let's stick to military escalation. Even this subcategory, though, as you might expect, is an immensely complex topic and one that's been interpreted in many different ways. A helpful metaphor, though, is the escalation ladder.
Welcome to ladders.
As the name suggests, you have a ladder with many different steps, each representing how you might respond to a situation with military force. At the bottom is normal peacetime conditions. You don't do anything. At the top, you have the unrestricted use of weapons of mass destruction. In the case of interstellar war, orbital bombardment would likely be near this top step. But between those two states, you have everything else. With each new step up the ladder, there is an increase in the intensity or scope of the conflict that crosses a threshold considered significant by one of the participants. Shows of military force, mobilization, limited conventional conflict, full-blown conventional war. Depending on a nation's capabilities, there can be hundreds or maybe even thousands of steps. But I hope it's obvious that the higher up we get on the escalation ladder, the greater the cost of the resolution, whether in economic, political, or military terms, and often all three. Therefore, when you find yourself climbing the ladder, your objective isn't just to prevail, but to get the most favorable outcome at the lowest possible step. The absolute ideal situation would be for your nation or military to have such a massive advantage that no matter where you are on the ladder, you can win. Unfortunately, this is pretty much impossible. The ladder is useful to understand escalation, but it's still just a social construct and exists only in the minds of the participants involved rather than objective reality. As such, each side might have very different ideas on what constitutes a significant step up, and these might not be recognized by the other side. Your enemy might be able to escalate a conflict in a way you're unwilling or unable to, or in a way that you don't even notice. And while some steps might be immediately obvious, in some instances, you might not have even realized you've climbed to a new step until it's too late. Simply put, this is a goddamn dangerous ladder, where it's incredibly easy to fall up and really hard to get down. If you don't know what you're doing, some damn fool thing in the Balkans can set off a global war that kills tens of millions of people. So to get back to what drill instructor Zim was saying, if your defense policy is based entirely around orbital bombardment or the threat of orbital bombardment to the point where you've neglected your army and don't have the ability to project power and conduct a planetary invasion, then you're forced to immediately escalate things pretty high up that ladder. Remember, a conventional army is capable of a lot more than just taking over a planet. As we'll discuss later on, there are multiple ways to use it during a planetary invasion. But without an army, most of the middle rungs are completely locked out to you, and because of that, you don't have a lot of room to maneuver. That high up on the ladder, the costs and risks might already outweigh the benefits of even a successful resolution. If you're faced with a relatively minor conflict, but you can only respond with orbital bombardment, you might find your only course of action politically and economically senseless. That's because this method of war might not even achieve the resolution you want. Orbital bombardment can't hold strategic locations, it can't capture enemy forces, it can't bring about a regime change or stop the flow of weapons into a demilitarized zone. All it can really do is destroy your enemy, and war is rarely that simple. I briefly mentioned the political, economic, and military consequences, but there's just too many to really get into. There might be valuable industries that need to be kept intact. There might be friendly personnel or citizens in the target area. The planet might have religious or cultural significance. Orbital bombardment might lower your nation's standing within a greater galactic community, or provoke a similar attack on your own worlds by a comparable enemy force. There are an endless number of reasons why escalating a conflict immediately to include the use of unrestricted orbital bombardment just isn't viable. I wouldn't expect you'd see the United Federation of Planets or the Galactic Republic using this tactic that frequently, but even the Imperium of Man regards the process of exterminatus as a last resort, and there's some worlds even they won't use it on. In fact, the people watching this video who haven't gotten this far in yet, but have already flooded the comment sections with declarations of exterminatus, show such a careless disregard for the Emperor's works that they should be considered heretical and executed. It would certainly spare me a lot of hassle on my end. So in these cases, when you're not willing to use these weapons, you might try to bluff the enemy, threaten to murder 100 billion people unless they surrender, and that might work, but you'll be bluffing a lot. And the first time your opponent calls your bluff and you don't act, then you're in trouble. If the enemy finds out you're not willing to cross a certain threshold, you don't want to climb a certain step on the ladder, then it doesn't matter how many virus bombs or plasma beams you have, they're all useless to you. The advantage of maintaining a significant ground force and the ability to conduct a planetary invasion is that your military options become much more flexible and you can limit escalation to achieve victory at a reasonable cost. It also opens up the ability for an entirely different kind of escalation that I haven't even touched on yet. Horizontal escalation. This is where you expand the geographic scope of a conflict rather than the intensity. Just as an example, let's look at the Martian Congressional Republic, the United Nations, and their struggle for supremacy over the solar system. A Martian Marine looking at the severe population disparity between the two sides has this assessment on the Martian ability to win a ground war on Earth. There was no way Mars could ever beat Earth on the ground. You could drop every Martian soldier fully armed into just one Earth city, and the citizens would overwhelm them using rocks and sticks. Now this Marine isn't wrong. A Martian conquest of Earth is a non-starter. But to take this as evidence that it's pointless for the Congressional Republic to maintain a Marine Corps and standing army is missing a key point. Earth is not the only location on which a ground war might occur. In a conventional war between the two, Mars doesn't need to immediately escalate things vertically and begin a surface bombardment of Earth. That probably won't end well for them either. Instead, they can escalate horizontally and pivot to other locations in the solar system where they enjoy a clear conventional military supremacy. This was an idea that was floated during the Cold War. If you can't stop a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, you don't try. Instead, you focus on the Far East. In this way, you might achieve the same military objective at a lower cost. At least in theory. Escalation management is inherently imperfect and often done poorly, but it's still much better to fail lower on the ladder than higher. Now, the Earth-Mars population disparity does lead to another argument I've heard against the viability of planetary invasions. The scale of the operation would just be too big. The effort of conquering an entire planet would put too much strain on any army and take so long so as to be simply impossible. I think these kinds of assertions make two very big assumptions. The first is that every planet is going to be like Earth, where you have billions of people scattered across thousands of cities. If the planet is a relatively new colony, however, or its geography isn't perfectly suitable for human life, its population might be significantly smaller and centralized in a few key areas. The planet might be huge, but you would only need to conquer a fraction of it. The same would be true if a planet has multiple nations and you're only at war with one of them. You know, like if the Covenant declared war on Brazil instead of the UNSC. The other major assumption is that armies will not grow in scale and capability. Yes, conquering an entire planet would be a significant challenge to any 21st century nation, but by the 23rd century, the situation might be very different. As a matter of course, armies have grown in size as the sophistication of the respective nation increases. In the Middle Ages, the army of Charlemagne hovered around 30,000 men. In modern terms, we call that a division. The Soviet Union had 300 divisions at the start of the Second World War, and the number only went up from there. An interstellar nation with hundreds of billions or even trillions of citizens would be able to raise armies of exponentially larger size than anything we can conceive of in the modern world. With such a force, even conquering an ecumenopolis like Coruscant is not impossible. We should also not forget that the Mongolian Empire took over almost 20% of the world, and the British took 25%. Even to people on horseback or sailing ships, sizable world conquest is not impossible. I think the last major argument I have in why a conventional planetary invasion should not be immediately ignored in favor of orbital bombardment is the ethical and moral consequences of such an act. It's one thing to say that you'll destroy city after city until a planet surrenders, but it's quite another to actually go through with it. How long can you maintain a policy like that before your population or even the military turns against you? Granted, ethics and morals are often the first things tossed aside during a total war, when the complete extermination of your civilization might be at stake. But in anything less than that, I don't think restraint is inherently a bad thing. It's possible a ground invasion might be just as destructive, but at least you have a bit more control in trying to prevent that. Now, with all those arguments in mind, I have to make it clear that I do think orbital bombardment would have its uses. It would almost certainly be an enormous tactical and strategic advantage in certain situations, but in most cases, I think its most effective use would be in supporting a conventional planetary invasion, not replacing it outright. Okay, so I never thought I'd use the term ladder so much in a discussion about planetary invasions, but hopefully by now I've convinced you of their merits. Invasions, not ladders. Next, you have to decide what kind of planetary invasion are you going to undertake. If we use amphibious landings as a kind of template, there's 5 distinct major operations that translate well to an interstellar setting. You might not consider all of them invasions, but I've been using that term kinda loosely anyways. The first is the one you're likely familiar with, a planetary assault. This is the most difficult type of planetary landing, and one of the most difficult military operations due to its complexity and scale. In a planetary assault, a landing force is launched from ships in orbit onto a hostile or potentially hostile terrestrial landing zone. It requires a rapid buildup of combat power on the planet, from an initial non-existent capability to a fully coordinated strike force. The landing force seeks to secure key objectives through aggressive offensive action and disrupts enemy defenses to permit the landing of supporting units and contribute to the rapid deployment of full combat power. You would expect a planetary assault to be the first operation that initiates further combat operations as part of a larger campaign. This might be to obtain a site for a forward-positioned airbase, to deny the use of an area or facility to the enemy, or to fix enemy forces or attention. In the largest campaigns, the objective of the landing force might be to secure a beachhead, a site in which forces can be concentrated and used as a springboard from which the total or partial conquest of the planet can be attempted. The invasion of Klendathu by the Terran Federation is a good example of a planetary assault, although more so in terms of concept than in execution. Infantry attempted to seize a beachhead on the planet and from there, seize objectives, as thinly defined as they might have been. Next up, we have a planetary raid. This is a swift incursion into a hostile or potentially hostile area, followed by a planned withdrawal. There's a number of reasons why this might be beneficial: to secure information, confuse the enemy, capture personnel or equipment, or destroy some specific capability. It also has the ability to significantly damage enemy morale. Raids might be conducted on their own, or in support of other operations elsewhere as a kind of diversion. A pretty good example of a planetary raid was Operation Archangel, in which the Interplanetary Strategic Alliance invaded Helgen, capital of the Helgen Empire. Their main objective here wasn't to conquer all of Helgen, but rather capture their leadership and force a surrender. And just as a quick aside, going back to the Mars-Earth disparity we've discussed a few times, this is the kind of operation that the Martian Congressional Republic might consider against the United Nations. No, they can't conquer New York City permanently, but the temporary seizure of the city might be just as effective. The third major kind of operation is a planetary withdrawal. These are almost the exact opposite of what we've discussed previously. In this case, your objective is to extract friendly forces from a hostile or potentially hostile location. This might be because enemy pressure is just too severe, or because there is an operational urgency to obtain forces for use elsewhere. As you might expect, especially in the case of the former, these can be exceptionally difficult operations to execute because they may be conducted under intense pressure and limited time. The first Battle of Geonosis is a really good example of a planetary withdrawal. You have a friendly force, in this case Jedi peacekeepers, trapped in enemy territory. Republic reinforcements arrive, extricate them from the battlefield, and redeploy the Jedi to support a planetary raid happening concurrently. This might be one of the greatest strategic masterstrokes within interstellar war. A planetary demonstration is essentially a planetary assault or raid that is never intended to actually proceed. It's a show of force meant to influence and misdirect an enemy's decision-making and cause them to select an unfavorable course of action. As a consequence, every aspect of it has to appear authentic. You would park your fleet of transports in orbit, make all the necessary preparations, send out communications and signals, and you might even begin deploying transports to the surface, but they would never actually land. At some point, they'd pull back and the ruse would be revealed. I can't find any example of a planetary demonstration. If you're aware of one, please let me know in the comments. So for this one, we'll have to use an amphibious example. During the Gulf War, the United States deployed two of its most famous assets, reactivated Iowa-class battleships off the coast of occupied Kuwait. They made sure these ships were highly visible on every news channel when they were used to bombard Iraqi forces. Marine units rehearsed amphibious exercises, again highly publicized, and American forces did everything they could to convince Iraq that a massive amphibious assault was going to take place, but it never did. Instead, the attack came from elsewhere, but Iraqi forces were so convinced that a landing was imminent, they never redeployed to counter the actual attack. It's easy to imagine the same kind of scenario playing out during an interstellar war. The last major type of planetary landing is a rather unique one, because it's not necessarily a combat operation. A crisis response involves all the characteristics of a planetary landing, but is intended to respond to an emergency. Common scenarios in which a crisis response would be launched fall into two broad categories. The first is a non-combatant evacuation operation. This would be very similar to a planetary raid, in that there is a rapid insertion of forces followed by a planned withdrawal. But the distinction here is that the objective is to retrieve civilians, VIPs, or even equipment and installations. If, for example, an embassy was being evacuated, this is the kind of operation that would occur. The second broad category is foreign humanitarian assistance. In this case, you're not engaging an enemy military force, but providing supplies, skills, equipment, and the special capabilities of units as they individually relate to disaster relief. I think this example especially is why, even in a universe in which orbital bombardment has made planetary invasions meaningless, it's still important to maintain that capability. Unfortunately, I again can't think of any interstellar example of a crisis response. Stargate Command conducted operations like this somewhat regularly, but the scale was very limited and didn't often involve orbital forces. The response to the Great Hyperspace Disaster by the Galactic Republic is probably a good example, but is currently lacking in footage and details, so it's really difficult to comment on it too much. But regardless of what kind of planetary landing you undertake, these operations will include the same basic phases. Now, normally when I see planetary invasions discussed, these phases are boiled down to some variation of the following. You have a space battle where you obtain orbital supremacy, then an air battle where you gain aerial supremacy, and then a land battle where you fight for control of the planet itself. I think this is a very simplistic approach, and one that really only describes a very specific kind of interstellar campaign, not a planetary landing operation. A more realistic and universal set of phases would be planning, embarkation, rehearsal, movement, and action. The planning phase begins with some kind of initiating directive. A higher authority has decided on some operational and strategic objectives to be achieved through the deployment of a planetary landing force. All the complex details are discussed, from how this operation will be integrated into a larger theater or campaign, to selecting the method of entry, landing areas, arming and refueling points, determining go, no-go, and abort criteria. And that last set of points is extraordinarily important. Planetary landings constitute an enormous risk, so you want a very clear set of standards for commanders to consider when deciding when to proceed and when to call things off. Here's a few examples. Orbital supremacy might not have been achieved, air superiority might not have been achieved, increased enemy strength in your landing areas or objectives, weather hindering planetary operations, weather hindering air operations, reduced number of orbital transports, reduced landing craft availability, reduced aircraft, orbital mines might be present, clearance of dropship approach lanes might not have been achieved, inability to mass friendly forces, or even a lack of diplomatic clearance.
Diplomatic community.
It's just been revoked.
The point is, planning is an immense effort and one that really never ends. Planning will be continuous throughout the operation as situations change. Still, it's useful to distinguish the planning phase from subsequent phases because of the changing relationship between the planetary landing force and its commanders. Planning before an operation is, after all, very different from planning it while it's underway. Next, we have the embarkation phase. This is where everything required by the landing force, personnel, equipment, and supplies is assigned shipping. The landing plan and the method by which elements are transported to the surface of a planet will heavily influence which units are embarked on which ships, how many landing craft you might need, and how units will be phased to the surface, all together or in groups. This requires a lot of flexibility to accommodate changes in the landing plan in response to enemy activity or casualties taken during the landings. After that, we have the rehearsal phase. Whether you're invading an alien fortress or Carnegie Hall, the method is the same. Practice, practice, practice. Here you test the practicality of your plans, the timing of detailed operations, and the combat readiness of the forces involved. You make sure every echelon of military units is familiar with the plan, and you test all your communication and information systems. If there is a flaw in the configuration of your landing forces, this is the stage in which you'd want to find it. How you rehearse, of course, will depend on your resources. This might be an actual planetary landing conducted on one of your own worlds, or as merely a command exercise. If you have holodecks, you'd want to use them now.
This is the moment we were training for all yesterday afternoon. And now for the battle plan. As you all know, the key to victory is the element of surprise. Surprise!
The movement phase is when your various elements enter the operational area, either from points of embarkation or from a forward deployed position. Your landing force is organized into movement groups, which are assigned prescribed routes with backup emergency routes if those are no longer viable. As soon as your forces enter the operational area, whatever your commanders might have defined that as, we enter the action phase. Depending on your plans, you might have done your best to conceal the existence or intentions of your landing forces. There might be supporting operations, trying to establish the conditions necessary for landing, such as the establishment of orbital or aerial supremacy. There might be pre-landing operations, such as using special forces to demolish obstacles in landing zones, breaching orbital mines, spotting for orbital bombardment, everything you can do to give your forces an advantage when they hit the planet. Once the landing has commenced, your focus will shift from supporting the orbit-to-planet movement of the force to maximizing the combat power of your landed elements. Now this is of course the barest of overviews. The number of variables and considerations that go into each phase is enough to intimidate even the most experienced officers. Ultimately though, you need some way of getting your forces and supplies from orbit down to the ground. Colloquially, we typically refer to these kinds of vehicles as dropships, although they might be officially designated as tactical or strategic airlifters, space lifters, transports, or maybe even standard warships with some sort of landing ability. But while their exact classification might differ across alternate worlds, I think we can group these dropships into a few semi-legitimate classes. In lieu of any overarching system, I'll just be making up my own names for them. The smallest of these is what I'm going to refer to as individual drop pods, and this would be essentially the interstellar version of a paratrooper. You have a single soldier loaded into some kind of outer shell to allow them to safely land on a planetary surface from orbit. I think the key characteristic of this kind of vehicle is that it's a single-use craft. Either it breaks apart during atmospheric entry, or once it's landed, it needs to be recovered if the drop pod is to be reused. The advantages here is that they can land in areas that might be inaccessible to a larger transport, potentially even forests or mountainous regions. They also represent smaller targets and are less likely to be hit by incoming fire. The disadvantage is that because each soldier is deployed individually, there is a greater chance they might be scattered beyond their defined landing area. Depending on how well or poorly the drop goes, soldiers might take additional time to regroup. I'd expect drop pods to mainly be used by smaller, special forces units for this reason. They would drop behind the enemy's lines or near an important objective, either ahead of or concurrently with the main invasion. Landing entire divisions of troops in this manner would likely result in a real logistical mess, with units dispersed unevenly and forced to regroup or create ad hoc task forces. A great example of a drop pod would be the M2 Trojan Horse capsules used by the Terran Federation. What I love about these is that they're designed to disintegrate on entry, not only to provide protection to the trooper inside, but to fill the skies with chaff to create radar noise and mask the location of the landing. By the time a soldier makes landfall, his capsule is pretty much gone. A more permanent example would be the single-occupant exo-atmospheric insertion vehicle, used by the orbital drop shock troopers of the United Nations Space Command. Or, the SOEIVs used by the ODSTs of the UNSC. Not only does it have a terrific name filled with military jargon, but it represents a different way that a drop pod might function. Through a combination of rocket thrusters and a drag chute, the pod lands intact. While you don't get the mess of chaff as with our previous example, you instead gain a supply cache as each pod is equipped with additional weapons, radios, medical equipment, and other materiel. During even a messy drop, there's no chance a soldier might be separated from the tools they need to fight and survive. In fact, specialized variants of these pods, specifically designed to deliver equipment, are also used. This would be great if you need to resupply a surrounded force without risking any transport craft. The next category is what I'd call heavy drop pods. Same basic concept, a single-use capsule, but one that can carry a fire team or an entire squad of infantry, or maybe even an individual armored fighting vehicle or some kind of tank. While it might not have the same level of flexibility as in what kinds of environment it can land, it removes the possibility that a squad might be scattered to the winds before landing. It also enables heavier equipment to be dropped directly into a landing zone. I especially like the idea of using these to deploy mechanized infantry. A squad could land and be immediately mobile. I'm not sure if it would be practical to land an entire army with these things, but again, for smaller operations or flanking maneuvers, these would be ideal. The Lucius pattern Deathstorm drop pods utilized by the Adeptus Astartes would be a great example of a heavy drop pod. They are fired from an orbiting starship, slamming through the atmosphere before firing retro rockets at the last second. They can deliver an entire squad of space marines or supplies directly onto a battlefield. They are notably just a bit too small to deliver vehicles though, so the Astartes sometimes replace the marine complement with an array of automated weapons, essentially dropping a sentry gun from orbit. I can't speak to its effectiveness, but it's an interesting solution nevertheless. Now we enter the realm of reusable vehicles, those that can land but then take off again, either because they won't survive long in a battlefield or because they're needed to ferry more troops down from orbit. The smallest of these is what I'd label a light dropship. They'd likely have a similar capacity as a heavy drop pod, but with an actual pilot. It would exhibit a lot more control over its landing. It can respond to a developing situation better, either changing its landing zone or even calling off the drop midway through as required. These are still probably a bit too small to land anything other than a light force, but for a planetary raid, these might be perfect. The UT-47 Kodiak is a great example of this. It can carry up to 14 people or a moderate amount of cargo. survive entry into extreme environments, and even possesses a limited FTL capability. Most variants are unarmed or lightly armed, as they're not really designed to provide fire support. They drop off their occupants and then get out. I'm a little less impressed with the intruders used by the Interplanetary Strategic Alliance during their invasion of Helgen. Purists might say this isn't technically a dropship because it can't be operated in a vacuum, but even though it needs to be deployed within an atmosphere, it fulfills the same basic role. However, even operating within just an atmosphere, its design isn't doing its passengers any favors. There's no method of receiving oxygen at higher altitudes, nowhere to even strap yourself in. I get the impression the ISA was desperate to invade Helgen as quickly as possible and didn't really have the time to develop the necessary equipment. This thing was probably being used to get furniture down from higher shelves before being pressed into military service. And I think the ISA agrees with me here, because it was immediately replaced with the heavier VTOL in the aftermath of the war. Next up, we have the medium dropship. Same concept, just bigger. At this point, depending on the technology involved, it might need a dedicated airstrip to land. In those cases, this likely won't be the first bit of hardware making planetfall, but rather exploiting a beachhead already established. I think this would likely be the mainstay transport of any interplanetary army, representing a pretty good middle ground. Small enough to evade enemy fire, but large enough to deliver a combat-ready force. The Crow dropship used by the Frontier Militia would be a pretty good example of a medium dropship. Fully loaded, it can carry a full squad with a rear-facing hinged ramp to allow the loading of vehicles or cargo. I should also probably give a shout out to the UC-67 Mestea used by the Antares Confederacy, an absolutely perfect example of a medium dropship, perfect in every way. But for transporting anything more than a squad or two, we need to look to our next major class, the heavy dropship. In my mind, this is probably the largest vehicle that you'd expect to see land anywhere near the front lines. And again, if it lacks that VTOL capability, it might need an established runway. Either way, it's a big target, but its main advantage would be its much larger capacity. A platoon or even a company might easily fit on one of these. I'd classify the Valkyrie SSTO, utilized by the Resource Development Administration, as a great example of a heavy dropship. It's meant to deliver cargo from orbit, but can also easily hold 60 infantry and 25 amp suits. It was probably a mistake to use it as a makeshift bomber, though. It didn't seem particularly agile. For direct fire support like that, I think you instead need to look to our next group of vehicles, starting with the light gunship. At first glance, this might seem very similar to the light dropship we discussed previously. But the key difference is that rather than immediately withdrawing from the landing zone, a gunship would remain on station acting as air support. The advantages to this approach should be obvious, a major force multiplier to any landing element. The Republic Low Altitude Assault Transport, or LAAT, fits firmly into this classification. It can hold up to 30 standing infantry, and immediately after deploying them, can provide fire support with laser cannons and missile launchers. A slightly larger variant also exists dedicated solely to deploying walkers. The UD-4 Cheyenne dropship would be another great example. I especially admire how the design can hold 60 Marines, or roughly half that, but with an M577 armored personnel carrier. I think the ability to have a gunship drop into combat with a fully loaded APC is a powerful combination, because any landing force is immediately mechanized with armored and air support. We fall into a familiar pattern with the medium gunship. Same basic idea, just larger, trading maneuverability and flexibility for a greater passenger and cargo capacity. The Mercury Star Runner used by the citizens of the United Earth Empire would be a good example of this. Heavily armed with a variety of weapon hardpoints and missiles, but with a sizable cargo bay and rear loading ramp. Many of the classes of dropship used to transport a lance of battle mechs would also fall into this category. They're required to transport much larger fighting machines and must therefore be far bigger themselves. They're also rather unique in that, instead of taking off and providing support from the air, they remain grounded, almost like stationary artillery. Now, a bit predictably I admit, we arrive at the heavy gunship. Generally, when you're deploying forces into combat, it's better to separate them into smaller groups so the loss of a single craft doesn't take with it an entire company. The idea that you'd want to land a very large gunship loaded with troops straight into enemy defensive positions doesn't make much sense. So I think instead what you'd see with these kinds of craft is them used to deliver their passengers and cargo to a secured landing area close to the front lines, but not under direct fire. Once empty, these gunships could then begin flying air support, not before. A good example of this would be the Manta missile destroyer used by the Tau Empire. It is equipped with an extensive array of armaments and, as their name implies, can be used as escorts during naval engagements, but they can also carry an entire hunter cadre and their associated battlesuits and anti-gravitic tanks. We end with a rather broad category of troop transports. These are dedicated starships meant to transport cargo and personnel, but unlike the other categories we've discussed, they are only intended to operate well behind the front lines. They're lightly armed, if they're armed at all, and are meant to reinforce already established planetary fronts. These are the spacecraft that would keep an army fighting on an alien world reinforced and resupplied. They might come in a variety of sizes, but will almost certainly be the most important element in maintaining an army's supply lines and logistics. The Republic Acclimator class used during the Clone Wars is a pretty good example of this. I think its armament was a bit excessive for the kinds of missions it was supposed to perform, but otherwise was capable of ferrying an enormous number of troops, vehicles, and supplies. 16,000 clone troopers, 48 AT-TE walkers, 66 LAAT gunships, 14 LAAT carriers, 320 speeder bikes, 36 SPHA artillery pieces, and 6 months worth of consumables. With that much on board, you wouldn't want this anywhere near enemy fire. If this thing needs to shoot its guns, somebody screwed up. So with that, we arrive at the end of our guide on how to launch a planetary invasion. Whether you are a rookie Marine currently en route to a hostile LZ in a rapidly disintegrating capsule, or the veteran of 100 interstellar campaigns, I hope you found it useful. If I had to boil it all down to just a few key points though, it would be this. Planetary invasions encompass far more than just the traditional battle to completely take over a planet. There are many operations, each with specific goals. Planetary invasions require enormous planning and logistical considerations. But most of all, planetary invasions and the armies that make them possible are ultimately options a nation can choose to accomplish their objectives. There may be times when these massive operations are inadvisable, but there might also be moments when they're the most reliable means to achieve results at an acceptable level of escalation. It's important to maintain a range of capabilities and responses. So if anyone who has made it this far into the video comes across someone trying to explain why planetary invasions would never happen, feel free to tell them from me that they really don't know what they're talking about. But that, of course, is just my opinion. And even though I will bombard from orbit anyone who disagrees with me, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Would you discipline a baby by cutting off its head? Are planetary operations a viable option within a larger interstellar campaign? Have I said orbital bombardment so many times that the words have lost all meaning? Let me know in the comments below, and until next time, this has been Incoming. In Incoming, the Templin Institute discusses the theories and ideas found across alternate worlds. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to join the Templin Institute, consider pledging to our Patreon page. Along with increased security access, you'll be able to vote in polls to determine future topics, get custom wallpaper every week, and receive some other exclusive rewards.